The Arkadi Monastery is an Eastern Orthodox monastery, situated on a fertile plateau 23 kilometers to the southeast of Rethymnon on the island of Crete in Greece. The current catholicon dates back to the 16th century and is marked by the influence of the Renaissance. This influence is visible in the architecture, which mixes both Roman and baroque elements. As early as the 16th century, the monastery was a place for science and art and had a school and a rich library. Situated on a plateau, the monastery is well fortified, being surrounded by a thick and high wall. The monastery played an active role in the Cretan resistance of Ottoman rule during the Cretan Revolt of 1866. 943 Greeks, mostly women and children, sought refuge in the monastery. After 3 days of battle and under orders from the hegemon of the monastery, the Cretans blew up barrels of gunpowder, choosing to sacrifice themselves rather than surrender. The monastery became a national sanctuary in honor of the Cretan resistance. The 8th of November is a day of commemorative parties in Arkadi and Rethymnon. The explosion did not end the Cretan insurrection, but it attracted the attention of the rest of the world. Topography. The Arkadi Monastery is located in the Rethymnon regional unit, 25 kilometers southeast of Rethymnon. The monastery is situated on a rectangular plateau on the northwest side of Mount Ida, at an altitude of 500 meters. The Arkadian region is fertile and has vineyards, olive groves and pine, oak and cypress forests. The plateau on which the monastery rests is surrounded by hills. The west side of the plateau stops abruptly and falls off into gorges. The gorges start at Tabakaria and lead to Stavromonos to the east of Rethymnon. The Arkadian gorges have a rich diversity of plants and native wildflowers. The area of the monastery is located in first developed in antiquity. The presence of Mount Ida, which is a sacred mountain because it was legendarily the childhood home of Zeus, made the area attractive to early settlers. 5 km to the northeast, the city of Aeleftherios had its cultural peak in the time of Homer and in classical antiquity, but its influence was also felt in the early Christian and Byzantine periods. The closest village to the monastery is Amnatos, located 3 km to the north. The villages that surround Arkadi are rich in Byzantine relics that prove the early wealth of the region. The Monastery Monastery, which is several km north of Arkadi, was also an example of the Grand Cretan monasteries. Arkadi Monastery is in the shape of a nearly rectangular parallelogram. The interior resembles a fortress and is 78.5 meters long on the north wall, 73.5 meters on the south wall, 71.8 meters on the east wall and 67 meters on the west wall. The total area of the monastery is 5,200 square meters. History. Founding. The exact date of the founding of the monastery is not precisely known. According to tradition, the foundation of the monastery is sometimes attributed to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius and sometimes to the Emperor Arcadius in the 5th century. And, according to the second version, the monastery took its name from the name of the emperor. However, in Crete, it is common for monasteries to be named after the monk that founded the building, which lends support to the theory that Arkadi may have been founded by a monk named Arkadios. Other such monasteries have Rontisio, Arsenio and Arisio. According to Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, the monastery was built on the site of an ancient city, Arcadia. Legend tells that after the destruction of Arcadia, all the springs and fountains stopped flowing until a new city was built. However, in 1837, Robert Pashley found evidence to suggest that it was impossible for the monastery to have been built on the ruins of another city, so this idea has lost credence. In 1951, the Professor K. Kallikerus published an inscription dating to the 14th century and verified the hypothesis that a monastery was dedicated to St. Constantine in this period. The inscription was located on the pediment of a church that predates the current one, over the entrance door. It read, "The church carrying the name of Arkadi is consecrated to St. Constantine." Restorations. Towards the end of the 16th century, the monastery was subject to restorations and transformations largely headed by Klimas and Vissarion Chortatsis, without a doubt from the family of Hortatsis of Rethymnon and Georgios Chortatsis, the author of Aerophili. Klimas Hortatsis was the hegemon of the abbey, and in 1573, he made the monastery cenobite. He oversaw the building of the church, which took 25 years and was believed to have begun in 1562. In 1586, the facade of the building was built, as were the two naves. An inscription at the base of the clock also dates it back to 1587. This inscription is as following: Alpha Phi Kappa Lambda Mu Chi Tau Zeta Pi Zeta, or 15 Klimas Chortatsis 87. Klimas Chortatsis likely died soon after the completion and was not able to attend the inauguration of the new church, which was sometime between 1590 and 1596. This is known thanks to a letter of the Patriarch of Alexandria, Meletios Pigas, in which he wrote that the inauguration ceremony was entrusted to Klimas's successor, the hegemon Mitrophanus Syrigos. Although this letter wasn't dated, one can place it between 1590, when Meletios Pigas was ordained the Patriarch, and 1596, when the hegemon Nicephor succeeded Sigeros. During the period of the first three hegemons, and up to the beginning of the 17th century, the Arkadi Monastery continued to boom, economically and culturally. The monastery became a great center for the copying of manuscripts, and although the majority were lost during the destruction of the building by the Ottomans in 1866, some survive in foreign libraries. The monastery grew with the construction of a stables in 1610 and a refectory in 1670. Ottoman period. In 1645, the Ottoman Empire began the campaign to conquer Crete. In the spring of 1648, they controlled the major part of the island, with the exception of Heraklion, Gramvousa, Spinalonga and Suda, which remained under Venetian rule. After the capture of Rethymnon in 1648, the Ottomans pillaged the monastery. The monks and the hegemon Simon Halkiopoulos took refuge in the Vrontisi monastery. They were allowed to return after having sworn allegiance to Hussein Pasha, who also gave them the right to ring the monastery's bell. The Arkadi Monastery therefore became the Kanli Monastir, a firm and authorized the rebuilding of the destroyed monasteries according to their original plans, without changes. Arkadi benefited but abused its rights by adding new buildings. During the Ottoman period, the monastery continued to prosper, which was shown in the writing of Joseph Pitton de Tournefort. For the traveler, Arkadi was the richest and most beautiful of the monasteries of Crete. There were 100 monks that lived in the convent and 200 others that lived in the surrounding countryside. The monastery's territory extended north of the sea into the east of Rethymnon to the top of Mount Ida in the south. These lands allowed the monastery to support itself through agriculture. Tournefort notes 400 measures of oil produced each year, a figure which would have been doubled if the monastery did not give the inferior olives to charity. Tournefort also boasts of the monastery's cellars, which had at least 200 barrels, labeled with the name of the hegemon, who blessed them each year with a prayer. The wine made at Arkadi was well known. This wine was called Malvoisie and was named after a town close to Heraklion. Franz Wilhelm Sieber, during his time in the monastery, recalled the hegumen's cellar and attributed the making of the wine to an excellent grape raised in high altitude, but that it was not produced at Malvoisie. At the beginning of the 17th century, the monastery fell into decline. Sieber, who stopped there nearly a century after Turnfurt and Pokak, left a less flattering description. By the time the German visited, the monastery only had 8 priests and 12 monks. Farming continued, but the monastery had debts. He recalled the hegumen who often had to go to Rethymnon in order to acquire funds to pay the bills. Sieber described the library of the monastery as rich in more than 1,000 texts, including religious texts and those of Pindar, Petrarch, Virgil, Dante, Homer, Strabon, Thucydides and Diodor of Sicily. But the traveller mentioned the sad state, noting that he had never seen books in such bad condition and that it was impossible to distinguish the works of Aristophanes from those of Euripides. In 1822, a group of Turkish soldiers led by Egetimilas took hold of Arkadi and pillaged it. The civilians of Amari gathered to plan how to retake the monastery and expel Egetimilas and his troops. Another version tells of a certain Antony Meladonos, a Sfakian from Asia Minor, who came to the island at the head of a group of Greek volunteers from Asia Minor in order to support the Cretan efforts in the War of Greek independence. With 700 troops, he set out across the island from west to east. After the pillaging of the monastery, he changed his course and went to Arkadi instead. Arriving in the night, his troops scaled the walls of the building and fired the monastery. He jumped on Egetimilas, who was drinking, grabbed him and threw him to the ground outside the room. He was about to kill Egetimilas when Egetimilas claimed to be at the point of converting to Christianity. A baptism immediately took place and the new convert was allowed to go free. Turkish and Greek documents mention the capacity of the monastery to produce enough food for the residents of the region and to hide fugitives from the Turkish authorities. The monastery also provided education for the local Christian population. From 1833 to 1840, the monastery invested 700 Turkish piasters in the schools in the region. Context: by the mid-19th century, the Ottomans had occupied Crete for more than 2 centuries, despite frequent bloody uprisings by Cretan rebels, while the Cretans were rising against the Ottoman occupation during the War of Greek Independence. The London Protocol of 1830 dictated that the island could not be a part of the new Greek state. On the 30th of March 1856, the Treaty of Paris obligated the Sultan to apply the Hatti Humayun, which guaranteed civil and religious equality to Christians and Muslims. The Ottoman authorities in Crete were reluctant to implement any reform. Before the majority of Muslim conversions, the empire tried to recant on liberty of conscience. The institution of new taxes and a curfew also added to the discontent. In April 1858, 5,000 Cretans met at Batsornaria. Finally, an imperial decree on July 7, 1858 guaranteed them privileges in religious, judicial and financial matters. One of the major motivations of the revolt of 1866 was the breach of the Hatti Humayun. A second cause of the insurrection of 1866 was the interference of Ishmi Pasha in an internal quarrel about the organization of the Cretan monasteries. Several laymen recommended that the goods of the monasteries come under the control of a council of elders and that they be used to create schools, but they were opposed by the bishops. Ishmi Pasha intervened and designated several people to decide the subject and annulled the election of undesirable members, imprisoning the members of the committee that had been charged with going to Constantinople for presenting the subject to the Patriarch. This intervention provoked violent reactions from the Christian population of Crete. In the spring of 1866, meetings took place in several villages. On May 14, an assembly was held in the Arkadi Monastery in Batsorn area near Hania. They sent a petition to the Sultan and the consuls of the big powers in Hania. At the time of the first meetings of the revolutionary committees, the representatives were elected by province, and the representative of the Rethymnon region was the hegemon of Arkadi, Gabriel Marinakis. At the announcement of these nominations, Ishmi Pasha sent a message to the hegemon via the bishop of Rethymnon, Kallinikos Nikolatakis. The letter demanded that the hegemon assemble the revolutionary assembly of the monastery would be destroyed by Ottoman troops. In the month of July 1866, Ishmi Pasha sent his army to capture the insurgents, but the members of the committee fled before his troops arrived. The Turks left again after destroying icons and other sacred objects that they found in the monastery. In September, Ishmi Pasha sent the hegemon a new threat of destroying the monastery if the assembly did not yield. The assembly decided to implement a system of defense for the monastery. On September 24, Panos Koronios arrived in Crete and landed at Bali. He marched to Arkadi, where he was made commander-in-chief of the revolt for the Rethymnon region. A career military man, Koronios believed that the monastery was not defensible. The hegemon and the monks disagreed, and Koronios conceded to them, but advised the destruction of the stables so that they could not be used by the Turks. This plan was ignored. After having named Ioannis Dimakopoulos to the post of commander of the garrison of the monastery, Koronios left. At his departure, numerous local residents, mostly women and children, took refuge in the monastery, bringing the valuables in hopes of saving them from the Turks. By the 7th of November 1866, the monastery sheltered 964 people, 325 men, of which 259 were armed, the rest women and children. Arrival of the Ottomans since the mid-October victory of Mustafa Pasha's troops at Vafes. The majority of the Turkish army was stationed in Apollonius and were particularly concentrated in the fortresses around the Bay of Suda. The monastery refused to surrender, so Mustafa Pasha marched his troops on Arkadi. First, he stopped and sacked the village of Episcopi. From Episcopi, Mustafa sent a new letter to the Revolutionary Committee at Arkadi, ordering them to surrender and informing them that he would arrive at the monastery in the following days. The Ottoman army then turned toward Rustica, where Mustafa spent the night in the monastery of the Prophet Eli, while his army camped in the villages of Rustica and Argios Konstantinos. Mustafa arrived in Rethymnon on the 5th of November, where he met Turkish and Egyptian reinforcements. The Ottoman troops reached the monastery during the night of November 7th, November 8th. Mustafa, although he had accompanied his troops to a site relatively close, camped with his staff in the village of Messi. Attack on the morning of the 8th of November, an army of 15,000 Ottomans and 30 cannons, directed by Suleiman, arrived on the hills of the monastery while Mustafa Pasha waited in the Messi. Suleiman, positioned on the hill of Kor, to the north of the monastery, sent a last request for surrender. He received only gunfire in response. The assault was begun by the Ottomans. The primary objective was the main door of the monastery on the western face. The battle lasted all day without the Ottomans infiltrating the building. The besieged had barricaded the door and, from the beginning, taking it would be difficult. The Cretans were relatively protected by the walls of the monastery, while the Ottomans, vulnerable to the insurgents' gunfire, suffered numerous losses. 7 Cretans took the position within the windmill of the monastery. This building was quickly captured by the Ottomans, who set it on fire, killing the Cretan warriors inside. The battle stopped with nightfall. The Ottomans received 2 heavy cannons from Rethymnon, one which was called Katsahila, They placed them in the stables. On the side of the insurgents, a war council decided to ask for help from Panos Koronios and other Cretan leaders in Amari. 2 Cretans left by way of the windows by ropes and, disguised as Turks, crossed the Ottoman lines. The messengers returned later in the night with the news that it was now impossible for reinforcements to arrive in time because all of the access roads had been blocked by the Ottomans. Combat began again in the evening of November 9th. The cannons destroyed the doors and the Turks made it into the building, where they suffered more serious losses. At the same time, the Cretans were running out of ammunition and many among them were forced to battle with only bayonets or other sharp objects. The Turks had the advantage. Destruction. The women and children inside the monastery were hiding in the powder room. The last Cretan fighters were finally defeated and hid within the monastery. 36 insurgents found refuge in the refectory, near the ammunitions discovered by the Ottomans, who forced the door. They were massacred in the powder room, where the majority of the women and children hid. Konstantinos Giaboudakis gathered the people hiding in the neighboring rooms together. When the Turks arrived at the door of the powder room, Giaboudakis set the barrels of powder on fire and the resulting explosion resulted in numerous Turkish deaths. In another room of the monastery holding an equal number of powder barrels, insurgents made the same gesture, but the powder was humid and only exploded partially, so it only destroyed part of the northwest wall of the room. Of the 964 people present at the start of the assault, 846 were killed in combat or at the moment of the explosion. 114 men and women were captured, but 3 or 4 managed to escape, including one of the messengers who had gone for reinforcements. The hegemon Gabriel was among the victims. Tradition holds that he was among those killed by the explosion of the barrels of powder, but it is more likely that he was killed on the first day of combat. Turkish losses were estimated at 1,500. The bodies were buried without memorials and some were thrown in the neighboring gorges. The remains of numerous Cretan Christians were collected and placed in the windmill, which was made into a reliquary in homage to the defenders of Arkadi. Among the Ottoman troops, a group of Coptic Egyptians were found on the hills outside the monastery. These Christians had refused to kill other Christians. They were executed by the Ottoman troops, and their ammunition cases left behind. 114 survivors were taken prisoner and transported to Rethymnon, where they were subjected to numerous humiliations from the officers responsible for their transport, but also by the Muslim population who arrived to throw stones and insults when they entered the city. The women and children were imprisoned for a week in the Church of the Presentation of the Virgin. The men were imprisoned for a year in difficult conditions. The Russian consulate had to intervene to require Mustafa Pasha to keep basic hygienic conditions and provide clothing to the prisoners. After 1 year, the prisoners were released. International reaction. The Ottomans considered taking Arkadi a big victory and celebrated it with cannon fire. However, the events at Arkadi provoked indignation among the Cretans but also in Greece and the rest of the world. The tragedy of Arkadi turned world opinion on the conflict. The event recalled the Third Siege of Missolonghi, and the numerous Philhellenists of the world were in favor of Crete. The volunteers from Serbia, Hungary, and Italy arrived on the island. Gustave Glorens, a teacher at the Collège de France, enlisted and arrived in Crete by the end of 1866. He formed a small group of Philhellenists with 3 other Frenchmen, an Englishman, an American, an Italian and a Hungarian. This group published a brochure on the question of the Orient and the Cretan Renaissance, contacted French politicians and organized conferences in France and in Athens. The Cretans named him a deputy at the assembly, but he turned the position down. Giuseppe Garibaldi, in his letters, praised the patriotism of the Cretans and the wish to gain their independence. Numerous Garibaldians, moved by an ardent Philhellenism, came to Crete and participated in several battles. Letters written by Victor Hugo were published in the newspaper Clio in Trieste, which contributed to the worldwide reaction. The letters gave encouragement to the Cretans and told them that their cause would succeed. He emphasized that the drama of Arkadi was no different than the destruction of Zara and the Third Siege of Missolonghi. He described the tragedy of Arkadi in writing these lines: "I am obeying an order from on high, an order that comes from agony. One knows this word, Arkadian, but one hardly understands what it means." And here are some of the precise details that have been neglected. In Arcadia, the monastery on Mount Ida, founded by Heraclius, 6,000 Turks attacked 197 men and 343 women and also children. The Turks had 26 cannons and 2 howitzers. The Greeks had 240 rifles. The battle lasted 2 days and 2 nights. The convent had 1,200 holes found in it from cannon fire. One wall crumbled. The Turks entered. The Greeks continued the fight. 150 rifles were down and out, and yet the struggle continued for another 6 hours in the cells and the stairways, and at the end there were 2,000 corpses in the courtyard. Finally, the last resistance was broken through. The masses of the Turks took the convent. There only remained one barricaded room that held the powder, and in this room, next to the altar, at the center of a group of children and mothers, a man of 80 years, a priest, the hegumen Gabriel, in prayer. The door, battered by axes, gave and fell. The old man put a candle on the altar, took a look at the children and the women and lit the powder and spared them. A terrible intervention. The explosion rescued the defeated. And this heroic monastery, that had been defended like a fortress, ended like a volcano. Not finding the necessary solution from the big European powers, the Cretans sought aid from the United States. At this time, the Americans tried to establish a presence in the Mediterranean and showed support for Crete. The relationship grew as they looked for a port in the Mediterranean, and they thought, among others, to buy the island of Milo, a port island. The American public was sympathetic. The American Philhellenes arrived to advocate for the idea of Cretan independence, and in 1868, a question of recognition of independent Crete was addressed in the House of Representatives, but it was decided by vote to follow a policy of non-intervention in Ottoman affairs.